hearing on the Subcommittee of Oversight will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biography, and truth and testimony disclosure for today's witness. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank my colleagues for being here today, and I want to especially thank our witness for his presence. We've been waiting a very long time to be able to question you, sir. I'm sorry that we had to come to the point of issuing you a subpoena to get that to happen, but I'm glad that you're here today, sir. In fact, the committee has invited you several times before on 5 different occasions. We wrote directly to you, Mr. Park, as well as the Director of Office of Science and Technology Policy. None of those invitations elicited the yes response that we got as a result of issuing you a subpoena. In the course of our correspondence, several claims were made by OSTP as to why you were not the individual to answer the committee's questions, such as that you and OSTP personnel have not been substantially involved in developing or implementing the federally facilitated marketplace security measures, that you did not develop or approve the security measures in place to protect the website, that you do not manage those responsible for keeping the site safe, and that you are not a cybersecurity expert, which is an interesting description of you, to say the least. You are the co-founder of Athena Health, which you co-developed into one of the most innovative health IT companies in the industry, and became very wealthy, in fact, doing that. As a government employee, you helped launch the President's Smarter IT Delivery Agenda, which created the new U.S. Digital Service. And you created the beta version of HealthCare.gov. How do these activities not require cybersecurity expertise? Further, on November 13, 2013, in testimony, sworn testimony, before the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, you said that you did not, quote, to quote you, actually have a really detailed knowledge base, unquote, of the website before it was launched, and that you were, again quoting you, quote, not deeply familiar with the development and testing regimen that happened prior to October the 1st, unquote. However, the committee has in its possession documents that appear to contradict much of what you have said in your prior congressional appearance, again under oath, as well as what OSTP has explained to this committee. But these documents were not easy to come by. Despite requesting them in a letter last December, and despite preparing to ask about them in a briefing OSTP arranged on your behalf in September, a briefing that was canceled the evening before it was scheduled to take place when your colleagues were informed it would be transcribed. Mr. Park, I find your and the White House lack of transparency intolerable and an obstruction to this committee's efforts to conduct oversight. It took a subpoena to get you here, sir. It took another subpoena to compel your documents from the White House. But even with that, we have yet to receive all of your documents in compliance with our subpoena issued on September the 19th, exactly 2 months ago. As a gesture of good faith, committee staff have engaged in multiple in-camera reviews with White House lawyers. Yet there are still documents being withheld from the committee without a claim of a legally recognized privilege. That begs the question, what are you hiding, Mr. Park? I have some theories about the answer to that question. Perhaps it is that you knew there were serious problems with HealthCare.gov prior to the launch, but you did not convey them on up the chain in your briefings with the President. Or perhaps you did, and they were ignored because of this administration's relentless pursuit to launch HealthCare.gov on October 1st, 2013, no matter what the consequences may be. Now here we are, a year later, and fresh into the beginning of the second open enrollment, with questions that still remain about this $2 billion debacle you're credited with fixing. A debacle that, I might add, got hacked this summer, and that, according to a recent Government Accountability Office report, still has weaknesses, as they say, quote, both in the processes used for managing information security and privacy, as well as the technical implementation of IT security controls, unquote. We look forward to this opportunity to ask you some of our questions, Mr. Park. I also now ask unanimous consent to submit documents for the record which will be referenced in some of our questions. Without objection, so ordered. Before I yield to the ranking member, Ms. Ada Bernice Johnson, my friend from Texas, and because of some conflict with the Democrats, we'll come back to Mr. Swalwell's statement later on. I might add that this is likely my last time of chairing this subcommittee on Oversight's hearing. And I'd like to thank my friends on both sides of the aisle, especially Chairman Smith, for a productive 2 years of hard work on this subcommittee. Our staff, both Democrat and Republican, have worked very hard. We worked together, I think, in as bipartisan manner as we possibly can. We might not have agreed on issues, all the issues. Some issues we did, some we didn't. But it's been a very productive 2 years, I think, and it's been something that I have been very privileged to chair this subcommittee. And I wish all of you very well next year. Now I recognize our ranking member, Ms. Ada Bernice Johnson, for her statement. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me express my appreciation for your service, since this might very well be your last chairing of this committee, and wish you well in the future. We have maintained a great relationship, although I must say that probably 99.9% of the time we've disagreed. But I want to welcome Mr. Park, the former Chief Technology Officer of the United States, to this committee hearing, and I appreciate, Mr. Park, your willingness to appear before us. I want to apologize to you for all the political theater that is unfolding around your appearance. Please keep in mind that this hearing is largely an excuse for the majority to again express their dislike for the Affordable Care Act and the online marketplace that has led millions of Americans to find medical coverage. I know that they do not like Obamacare. The majority has voted at least 53 times during this Congress to repeal or dismantle ACA. Nevertheless, I want to ask all members here today to please remember that Mr. Park is not personally responsible for ACA, nor is he responsible for the problems on October 1st, 2013. Mr. Park, it is clear that you were not responsible for how the website performed last October 1st. In doling out responsibility for its performance on day one, I think it was fair to assign you 0% of the responsibility, which reflects the degree of your actual involvement in developing the website. Of course, your job at the White House put you in a position to have more insight than most into how the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services were doing in developing the program. But the management of the program was up to CMS, and the people doing the actual development work were contractors who legally answered to CMS. As I'm sure you would agree, insight into what is going on does not equate to being intimately involved or directly responsible for the website. And of course, your real job at CTO during that period had you leading multiple interagency initiatives designed to push technology into the American economy and across society. For example, you were working to make U.S. government data more easily accessible by the public, which can spur innovation, profits, and jobs. as has been amply demonstrated by the way that publicly available National Weather Service data has spawned a multi-billion-dollar weather forecasting industry. Mr. Park, I think it is fair to say that fundamentally you were working to make services of the government more readily available to citizens during your tenure at CTO. You were working to help reduce information costs in various areas of the economy, notably your Green Button initiative to let consumers get a better idea about energy consumption and sourcing. You were facilitating dialogues across communities to bring experts on particular social issues face to face with experts from the IT world. Laudably, you were a part of an initiative aimed at stopping human trafficking and another initiative designed to find ways to harness IT more effectively in disaster response. I know that as I cite these examples, I'm just scratching the surface of the scope of your day job at CTO of the United States. Regrettably, the committee has made no effort to understand this broad portfolio of your accomplishments there, and has shown little appreciation for your patriotic desire to serve, even though it meant leaving the lucrative world of Silicon Valley IT startups and venture capital. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for all you did and tried to do, including joining the team tasked with fixing the HealthCare.gov site after October 1st. I hope your experience with this committee won't diminish your sense of pride in your accomplishments or dampen your enthusiasm for public service. We need people like you to be willing to come serve this country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I disagree with you about a couple of issues. One is that we have recognized Mr. Park's accomplishments and responsibilities outside of being involved in HealthCare.gov. In fact, he himself has said he's not been deeply involved, though there are going to be emails that we have and you have that show otherwise. So it's not a zero involved, and it seems to be the mantra of this administration that people are zero involved and so have no responsibility for issues. But thank you, Ms. Johnson. Now I recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Lamar Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans have seen firsthand the misrepresentations that surround Obamacare. First, there was the president's broken promise that, quote, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. Then, in a video that surfaced last week, MIT professor Jonathan Gruber, a principal architect of Obamacare, admitted how the administration sold this to the American people, saying, quote, lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. Basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever, but basically that was really, really critical to getting the thing, Obamacare, to pass, end quote. Finally, after a year request by this committee, the administration has agreed to have someone who worked in the White House testify about the lack of security of the HealthCare.gov website. Mr. Todd Park was the White House Chief Technology Officer for the Office of Science and Technology Policy from March 12 to August 2014. Joining the Obama administration in the Department of Health and Human Services, Mr. Park was one of the principal architects for the Obamacare.gov website. Former Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius later called this website, quote, a debacle with a recent estimated cost of $2 billion. Today we will review the White House's repeated misinformation about the HealthCare.gov website. Mr. Park's own emails show an in-depth, detailed knowledge about cybersecurity issues with the website. He was the primary spokesperson for the White House about the website and the website's security. Mr. Park directed several contractors to review the security of the website. On October 10th, soon after the website went operational, Mr. Park read an online article by David Kennedy, a White House hacker who has testified twice before this committee. Mr. Kennedy's article was entitled, Is the Affordable Care Website Secure? Probably not. Mr. Park commented in an email how he was advised that, quote, these guys are on the level, end quote. We're asking Mr. Park to explain his role in developing the $2 billion website and what the administration knew about the security risk of the website. As of today, the White House still has failed to provide this committee with all the documents that are subject to the subpoena. The ones we do have paint a far different picture than that of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. As I mentioned, the committee has not received all of the emails and other documents that were subject to the subpoena, so another hearing may well be necessary. Finally, I want to take a moment to thank the chairman of the Oversight Committee, Dr. Paul Brown, for his tireless efforts on this subject, as well as so many other subjects that have come before this subcommittee. We appreciate his public service and his dedication over the years to his constituents, to Congress, and to our country. So, Chairman Brown, thank you again for all you've done. We appreciate all your great work, and I look forward to today's hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. As I announced earlier, Mr. Swalwell will be joining us in a bit, and he will give his opening statement at that time and then ask his questions in due order. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's witness, Mr. Todd Park, the former Chief Technology Officer of the United States and Assistant to the President. Prior to this role, Mr. Park served as Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and before entering federal service, Mr. Park co-founded Athena Health and co-led its development into one of the most impressive health IT companies in the industry. As our witness should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Mr. Park, it is the practice of the subcommittee on oversight to receive testimony under oath. If you now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear and affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative and has taken the oath. I now recognize Mr. Park for 5 minutes to present your testimony, sir.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Brown, thank you for your service. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Swalwell, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, good morning. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to offer testimony to you today. To begin, I'd like to provide some context for my time as U.S. Chief Technology Officer that will be helpful in addressing questions you've asked me to answer. I'm a private sector health IT entrepreneur by background and have been blessed with significant success in that arena. Only in America can the son of 2 brave immigrants from Korea have the kind of business building experiences that I have been blessed to have. I love this country very much, and it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve it. In March 2012, after 2.5 years working at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, I joined the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy as U.S. CTO. In this role, my primary job was to serve as a technology policy and innovation advisor across a broad portfolio of issues, working on open data policy and initiatives, wireless spectrum policy, how to advance a free and open internet, how to harness the power of technological innovation to fight human trafficking and improve disaster response and recovery, and more. My role as U.S. CTO was not to oversee the internal federal IT budget and operations. However, given my background at HHS and as a health IT entrepreneur, I was asked to provide assistance to CMS, which was the agency in charge of managing the development of the new HealthCare.gov, including the federally facilitated marketplace for health insurance. I provided assistance to CMS in a few different capacities. For example, I served as one of 3 co-chairs of an interagency steering committee organized by the Office of Management and Budget, and which focused on providing a neutral venue in which agencies like CMS, IRS, SSA, and others could work through interagency items, primarily in support of the Data Services Hub, which ended up going live quite successfully. I assisted with a red team exercise in early 2013 that helped identify actions to improve project execution, as well as some associated follow-on work that summer. From time to time, I helped connect people to each other, served as a spokesperson of sorts, and provide help on particular questions. However, to properly calibrate your expectations of my knowledge of CMS's initial development of the new HealthCare.gov and the federally facilitated marketplace, I was not a project manager who was managing and executing the day-in and day-out operational work of building the new HealthCare.gov and the federally facilitated marketplace. This was the responsibility of CMS. I didn't have the kind of comprehensive, deep, detailed knowledge of the effort that a hands-on project manager would have, and which I have had about other projects in my private sector work. I assisted CMS with its work as an advisor while executing my overall duties as White House Technology, Policy, and Innovation Advisor, working on a broad range of policy issues as I described earlier. As the new HealthCare.gov and the federally facilitated marketplace rolled out in the fall of 2013, as the extent of operational issues with the site became clear, it became an all-hands-on-deck moment, and I, along with others, dropped everything else I was doing and increased my involvement in HealthCare.gov dramatically, shifting full-time into the HealthCare.gov turnaround effort and working as part of the tech surge, which radically improved the performance of the site. I worked as part of a terrific team, working around the clock, even sleeping on office floors. My particular focus was on helping to reduce the amount of time the site was down, improve the site's speed, improve its ability to handle high user volume, and improve user-facing functionality. Our team effort drove massive improvement in the site, ultimately enabling millions of Americans to successfully sign up for health insurance through the site, many of whom had previously been uninsured. At the end of the day, on April 15, 2014, the last day of extended special enrollment, I went back to my U.S. CTO day job of being Tech Policy and Innovation Advisor, and my involvement in HealthCare.gov accordingly scaled back dramatically. As another contextual note, I understand that the committee's primary interest has been the security of HealthCare.gov. I do not have the expertise in cybersecurity that the professors of cybersecurity and other experts who previously testified before this committee have. Responsibility for the cybersecurity of HealthCare.gov rests with CMS. My involvement with the security of HealthCare.gov has been rather tangential. The Interagency Steering Committee I co-chaired had a privacy and security subgroup, but the subgroup was staffed and led by agency personnel who occasionally asked the overall committee co-chairs to help facilitate interagency dialogue and cooperation, but who generally drove to the ultimate answers themselves. There were a small number of other occasions when I was asked to serve as a spokesperson of sorts, summarizing general cybersecurity content supplied by CMS and HHS, to function as a liaison or facilitator connecting people to each other, or to provide my general thoughts for whatever they were worth. But again, I am not a cybersecurity expert. As a final contextual note, at the end of August of this year, in order to stay married, I stepped down as U.S. CTO and returned home to Silicon Valley, fulfilling my wife's long-standing desire to do so. I continue to serve our country as a consultant to the White House based in Silicon Valley, focused primarily on attracting more and more of the best tech talent in the nation to serve the American people, which is important to our vital work as a government to radically improve how the government delivers digital services and unleashes the power of technology in general. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some context for my testimony today, and I look forward to answering your questions as best I can.
Thank you, Mr. Park, for your testimony. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair at this point will open the first round, or the round of questions. The chairman recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Park, let's clarify something. You claim in your opening statement today that you did not have, to quote you, quote, comprehensive, deep, detailed knowledge, unquote, of development, testing, and cybersecurity of HealthCare.gov website, and that you, quote, assisted CMS with its work as an advisor, unquote. Yet if you refer to tab 8 in your binder there, you can read along from the highlighted sections of one of your subpoenaed emails dated June 26, 2013, sent to Marilyn Taverner, Michelle Snyder, and Henry Chow about, quote, a deep dive session with Henry Chow. Specifically, you wrote, quote, Marilyn, I'm also going to visit with Henry and team for one of our evening deep dive sessions to get up to speed on the latest status of IT and testing. There's no substitute for an evening deep dive. So I'll bring healthy food and snacks to Baltimore and camp out with Henry and team for a few hours, unquote. Mr. Park, please explain to me how you define deep, detailed knowledge, and then contrast that with a deep dive experience with Mr. Chow that lasts for several hours.
Sir, I'd be delighted to. So in my private sector experience, when you have really deep, detailed, comprehensive knowledge of a project, that comes from being the project manager. That comes from being the person who's in charge of running things. You know what's going on. You know each axis of what's going on an ongoing basis. That's the role I've served in my private sector life on a variety of projects, but that was not the role I was serving on the Federally Facilitated Marketplace. That was CMS's responsibility. What's happening here is that on a few occasions I spent time with the folks who were actually running the project and asked a series of questions and got information. But that level of knowledge pales in comparison to the really deep, detailed, comprehensive knowledge that you would have as the project manager running the thing on an ongoing basis.
So you had some supervisory function there. Mr. Park, do you agree with Health Secretary Kathleen Sebelius' assessment that the rollout of the website was a debacle?
The rollout was unacceptable, sir.
Mr. Park, you acknowledged in your opening statement that you were one of 3 White House co-chairmen of the Affordable Care Act Information Technology Exchanges Steering Committee, and that at least initially met on a monthly basis. What was your role in these meetings? Would you say that you were the leader of this White House trio?
I would say that I was one of the 3 co-chairs. It was actually principally led and organized by the Office of Management and Budget. And the role of the committee was to focus on providing a neutral venue where agencies could come together and work on really interagency issues, primarily in support of the Data Services Hub.
Well, on April 11th, 2013, in an email sent at 2:31 p.m., that's in tab 1
Oh, thank you, sir.
Of your binder, with the subject coordination on ACA, one of the co-chairs, Mr. Stephen Van Rokel, then U.S. Chief Information Officer, expresses concerns about your closeness to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services by writing this. Quote, CMS is not being inclusive and is not leading a coordinated effort that will lead to success. I'm also worried that you are getting a too CMS-centric picture. I would love nothing more than this not to be the case. To be assured ACA implementation is on a path we want to be on and that existing efforts will deliver what we want, unquote. Your response to him, sent the same day at 4:58 p.m., states, quote, hey, brother, thanks so much for the note and the chat. Many apologies for not staying in a tighter sync with you on this. We'll make sure that we stay in close sync going forward, unquote. To be clear, this is the same CMS that the Office of Science and Technology Policy has told the committee in various letters is in a, quote, far better position to discuss the standards that are in place for the website, unquote. You did not deny this closeness to Mr. Van Rokel, and indeed your closeness to individuals such as Henry Chow, Chief Information Officer at CMS, and Michelle Snyder, then Chief Operating Officer at CMS, and the number 2 official, is evident in many emails that we have seen of your conversations with them. If you're not the leader, then why was Mr. Van Rokel looking toward you for guidance? And if you were so close to CMS that it concerned your co-chair, then surely you would just find a position to answer our questions about the website and should have done so a year ago.
Sir, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this particular email. As I recall, I think this was precipitated by the fact that I had assisted, as I said in my opening testimony, with a red team exercise that CMS had engaged in to basically assess risks and identify mitigative actions to mitigate those risks in early 2013. Steve was actually not involved with that, and he was expressing concern about the fact that he wasn't synced up and was worried about a variety of different things. What I can say, as actually the email says, is that we did sync up. We were going to, and then I can report that we did sync up on the red team results and recommendations. and the path forward on the steering committee and other items and his concerns basically were dealt with in a way that was satisfactory to him.
Well, my time's expired. I now recognize Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown summarized your explanation regarding deep dives by saying you had some supervisory responsibilities. Did you indeed have supervisory responsibilities?
I would not define it that way. I was an advisor assisting CMS. But CMS was responsible for delivering the federally facilitated marketplace and the new HealthCare.gov.
How would you describe your work on HealthCare.gov during your tenure there at CTO?
Yes. So we're talking about the new HealthCare.gov, the federally facilitated marketplace. I would again describe it as I referred to in my opening testimony. I assisted CMS in a few different capacities, serving as a co-chair of this interagency steering committee, focused on providing a venue for agencies to work together on interagency issues in support of the hub, assisting with the red team exercise and follow-up to the red team exercise that summer, serving on from time to time as a spokesperson, as a liaison, as someone who could help with particular questions. I began as an assistant, as an advisor to CMS, and certainly not as the person who is the hands-on project manager running the thing. I was doing this assistance work as I was fulfilling my much broader portfolio of duties as technology policy and innovation advisor at the White House.
Could you give me a little idea as to what that broader responsibility for being the chief technology officer over and above or around or in conjunction with, or whatever way you want to put it, for the .gov program for the healthcare?
Yes, ma'am. So as U.S. CTO, my job was to be a tech policy and innovation advisor at the White House, focused on how can technological innovation help build a brighter future, create a brighter future for the country and for the American people. And so there was a wide range of initiatives that I worked on and championed. So you mentioned one in your opening statement. I mentioned a few, but the open data policy, open data initiatives work of the administration, which really focused on opening up the information and knowledge in the vaults of the federal government, such as weather data, health data, energy data, public safety data, et cetera, as machine-readable fuel that taxpayers had paid for, and returning it back to the American people and American entrepreneurs and American innovators and researchers to turn into all kinds of incredible new products, services, and companies that help people and that create jobs. I also was one of the creators and leaders of the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which was an effort to bring in the most amazing technologists and tech entrepreneurs from outside government and team them up with the best people inside government to work on projects like Blue Button, which has enabled well over 100 million Americans to be able to download copies of their own health information. I did a whole bunch of work in figuring out how we could tap into the ingenuity of the private sector and non-profit sector to help use the power of technology to fight the evil of human trafficking, to help improve disaster recovery and response, and other key priorities. I worked on policy issues like how do you advance a free and open internet, how do you actually massively improve the supply of and utilization of wireless spectrum available to the country, and more. It's the most amazing experience I've ever had.
It appears to me that though you were a person that could be asked a question or included in a loop, that your responsibilities were really very broad and really had no key responsibility toward the HealthCare.gov.
So there was a chunk of my time that I reserved for basically being helpful, being an advisor on issues that came up beyond the initiatives that I was championing or co-championing. And that's the bucket in which I put being helpful to CMS on HealthCare.gov, which I did try to do in the capacities that I described.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Now I recognize full committee chairman, Mr. Smith, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Park, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, sir.
As I understand it, you were briefed and given notice on several occasions that there were problems with the Obamacare website. So my question is, did you believe that the website was secure when it was first made operational?
I think, over the course of any large-scale digital search development project, there are issues and challenges that come up.
Did you think the website was secure before it was operational?
I did, sir, to the
You
best
did think
of my
it was
understanding.
secure, despite the warnings you got, despite the briefings you had, pointing out the problems, you still thought it was secure?
My understanding was that it was.
What did you think yourself?
Again, I'm not an expert.
Did you discount the briefings and the notice that you had gotten?
So which briefings and notices are you referring to, sir?
Well, there was a red team, there were emails, and then other indications that you knew that there were problems.
So the red team exercise didn't really focus on security. The red team focused on how the project was being run.
Well, I have, the McKinsey report is what I'm talking about that
Yes.
pointed out the problems.
I'm referring to the same report,
Yeah.
sir. Yeah. So it didn't really focus on security. It focused on how the project was operating and running generally.
But it still pointed out problems, and you still decided that they were not significant enough, I guess, to put you on notice that it shouldn't be operational?
So the McKinsey report, again, addressed the general management of the project.
Right.
And talked about specific...
Again, they pointed out the problems, but you discounted the problems?
Each of the issues, the risks, was tied to an action to mitigate that risk and deal with that risk.
So you think all the risks were addressed before the website was made operational?
I think that the risks identified by the Red Team report, my understanding is that they were addressed.
Well, that's amazing because both then and more recently, all the various studies that were conducted, not a one found that the website was secure, not a one found that the website was without risk. More recently, the U.S. Government Accountability Office found, quote, HealthCare.gov had weaknesses when it was first deployed, including incomplete security plans and privacy documentation, incomplete security tests, and the lack of an alternative processing site to avoid major service disruptions, end quote. This report also finds, quote, weaknesses remain both in the processes used for managing information security and privacy and so forth. So you've got these outside studies saying that it was not secure at the beginning and it remains insecure. I mean, do you think the website is secure today despite all these warnings by independent objective entities?
So CMS is the best source of information about the detailed security.
You discount the Government Accounting Office, the Government Accountability Office's review? I mean, that's the language I just read you are direct quotes from the GAO.
So, sir, I'm not an expert in this arena. I don't want to comment.
You said repeatedly you were an advisor. As an advisor, do you advise people that the website is secure today?
That's not the area where I really concentrated my advisory work.
Well, knowing what you know now, do you consider the website to be secure today?
So based on my understanding, I would use it. I have my family.
No, I didn't ask you whether you'd use it. That's easy for you to say yes. Do you think the website is secure today?
My understanding is
Would you advise the American people that the website is secure today?
My understanding is that it is. But, again, I would say that the best...
Despite the GAO, despite all these studies, despite all these reports saying it's not, you still think it is?
The best source of information about that is CMS, and they've got a dedicated team.
They're obviously biased. They've got an in-house conflict of interest to say anything else. Do you discount all these third-party entities, these credible organizations saying that it's insecure? Do you disagree with them?
Sir, again, I would just refer you to CMS for...
Like I say, you're asking the people that developed the plan whether it's secure. What else are they going to say? I was asking you as an advisor whether you thought these independent entities' reports were accurate or not.
I can't say that I've actually gone through...
Okay. Last question is this. Did you advise the White House at any point or meet with the White House or brief the White House about about Obamacare's rolling out?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Did you, at any point, brief the President or the White House about the Obamacare website before it went operational?
So as I can recall...
and roughly how many times, if you did?
As I can recall, I gave a briefing to senior White House officials about the results of the Red Team review in early 2013.
How many times did you brief White House personnel?
So if we're talking with senior White House advisors...
how many times, roughly?
I can recall 2.
Okay. And during either of those times, if 2 or more times, did you ever say anything to them about the problems that were inherent in the system or about any of the warnings that you had received?
So in the both the Red Team briefing from early 2013 and then the follow-on in July.
Well, again, my question was fairly specific. Did you alert the White House staff to any problems with the website?
So we were very clear, yes, about the risks identified.
You
by
did
the Red
make
Team.
it clear to the White House that there were risks.
That there were risks, and here were the actions to mitigate those risks.
But that the actions had not been taken yet, or that they had been taken yet?
Well, the actions at the time we identified the Red Team risks, we presented both the risks and the actions, and then in July we presented that the actions had been taken.
Okay. So you notified the White House of the risk, and then you came back later and said that you had remedied those risks, even despite outside entities saying that there were still problems.
So this was specifically on how the project was being run. And again, just to be super clear, I briefed on the McKinsey work to senior White House officials that there were risks that needed to be dealt with, and then there were actions that were needing to be taken to mitigate those risks.
Okay, thank you.
Then,
that answered my question. Thank you, Mr. Park. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Now recognize Mr. Peters for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your service on the committee. It's been a pleasure to serve with you, and we'll wish you the best going forward. Thank you. There's been some discussion on the security of HealthCare.gov in reference to a hack over the summer, and it's not necessarily true that means that the information that the site is insecure. HHS worked with the Department of Homeland Security to analyze the effects of the package found on the site. And according to the Director for U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness at DHS, this type of malware is not designed to extract information. There's no indication that any data was compromised as a result of the intrusion. I would like, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Ms. Tavener to Congressman Issa of November 14, 2014, in which Ms. Tavener states that no one has maliciously accessed personally identifiable information from HealthCare.gov.
Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Park, for being here. In your testimony, you mentioned that you were not the project manager of HealthCare.gov, but you function as the project manager for other projects when you were in the private sector. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Since my colleagues have suggested that you were the project manager of HealthCare.gov or functioned as such, I thought it would be helpful to discuss the kinds of activities that a project manager does. And you founded Athena Health with Jonathan Bush, incidentally the cousin of former President George Bush.
Yes, sir. My best friend.
Athena Health provides healthcare practices with services including cloud-based medical billing and electronic medical record services, which aims to make healthcare more efficient and effective, correct?
Yes, sir.
Since you built the company, can you describe what was involved in creating the company from the ground up? What tasks were involved with developing a new IT company?
Thank you, sir. As I think others who have had similar experiences would share, it's a big, complex undertaking. You put together the best team that you can. You raise initial money. You put together the best plan you can, but understand that that plan is likely to survive about 17 seconds of contact with the reality. You put together an initial prototype as fast as you can of your product and try to figure out, based on actual customers using it, what the real issues are and the real opportunities are, and then you iterate the plan, you iterate the product, you iterate execution constantly, right? And it's an all-consuming thing, and you have in your head each key axis of effort, how the conditions are changing, how plan, product, and execution are changing constantly, and balance all of that together.
Is it fair then to say when you're on the project management, you were very hands-on, at Athena. You had a comprehensive, deep understanding of the effort, very detailed knowledge of the projects and products based on your day-to-day engagement?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what is the difference between that role at Athena Health and the role you played with respect to the healthcare marketplace as CTO in the government?
It's night and day, sir. As I think anyone who has built a company or led a large initiative would tell you. I, again, did advise and assist CMS in a few different capacities, as I described in my testimony and earlier, written testimony and earlier. But again, it's very different from being the project leader, the project manager, actually running the day-to-day and having the kind of comprehensive, detailed, multi-axis knowledge that you have in that context.
In one of the emails that the committee's provided, you describe yourself as a consigliere. Is that kind of what you mean? As an advisor?
As an advisor, yeah.
Okay. I do think it strikes me that the role of project manager is fairly well defined as being different from what you were doing. I think that's pretty clear. I just offer too that one of the mistakes we make here in Congress is pulling people out of the bureaucracy and beating them up when we're all really trying to get to the same place. We'd like to get our government to be functioning, a healthcare website that's functioning. And I would just observe that I've seen this in the Armed Services Committee too. We're trying to get the best technology people we can to come work for the government. And in the defense side, we have a great need for cyber warriors. And it's the kind of we have to be very sensitive about how we treat people like you and like those folks who can be in the private sector making much more money, who are willing to give up their time to delay their careers, to step out of them, and to help the government. And I want to thank you for your service. I want you to know that I appreciate it, and I hope that you're able to help continue to recruit the very, very best to come help us in this effort and other efforts throughout the government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Now I recognize Mr. Sensenbrenner for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Park, when you testified before the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, you repeatedly claimed ignorance about any issues with HealthCare.gov prior to the website's launch. You testified that you have, quote, no detailed knowledge base of what actually happened pre-October 1, unquote. You further testified that you were, quote, deeply familiar with the development and not deeply familiar with the development and testing regimen that happened prior to October 1. But the email record tells a very different story. On June 11th, you emailed staff at CMS asking to check in on how things are going with respect to marketplace IT development and testing. On June 26th, you said you would visit Henry Chow of CMS and his team for 1-hour evening deep dive sessions. And on July 12th, Henry Chow referenced a briefing that you were doing for the President. If you were preparing to brief the President and doing deep dives with CMS staff in June and July of 2013, how can you claim to have no knowledge of issues prior to October 1st of that year?
Thank you for the opportunity to answer your question. What I said at the hearing last November was they didn't have really detailed knowledge, a really detailed knowledge base, if I recall correctly, of what actually happened in the run-up to October 1st. And as I've described previously, when I say really detailed knowledge base of what actually happened, that's the kind of knowledge that comes from being the hands-on project manager running the thing, and not the kind of knowledge that one would have as an assistant advisor who, on a series of occasions, meets with the people who are running the thing and asks questions. So that's what I would say.
Well, obviously on the June 11th email where you said you were going to check in on things were going with respect to marketplace IT development and testing, you just didn't ask that question out of the blue. Obviously, you were detailed to or decided to try to check up on this. And then I don't know what goes on at deep dive briefings. I imagine that there's quite a bit of detail that goes on, but I guess it kind of boggles my mind that if you didn't know the detail of that, why were you asked to go and brief the president? Or wasn't he interested in really the detail of what was going on, just whether it was going well or not?
Could you just refer me again to the email you're talking about?
Okay, I referred to two emails. You emailed the staff at CMS to check in on how things were going with respect to marketplace IT development and testing, and then on June 26th, 2 weeks and a day later, you said you would visit Henry Chow and his team for a 1-hour evening deep dive session.
Could you just refer me, I'm so sorry, to the tabs in the binder?
I don't know if you have the same binder I have, but
I see.
What? This is the tab on the deep dive session, number 8.
Okay. So again, just speaking to this session, the difference between the really detailed knowledge base that you have as a hands-on project manager and the knowledge that you have from asking people running the project a set of questions over the course of a few hours is, again, just night and day. And also, I think, to address something you asked earlier, as I recall, the trigger event for the check-in that you described was to follow up on the red team recommendations with respect to how the project should be managed and make sure those recommendations had been implemented by CMS. And so that was the trigger event for the inquiry.
Yeah, well, you denied involvement in your testimony before the OGR committee, but obviously you were involved because you asked how things were going. Then you asked for a deep dive briefing, and you came in to brief the president on this. And you know, it seems a complete disconnect between you claiming ignorance and, you know, I don't think that what you did, the information you did get, filled you in, and you certainly weren't ignorant. And you know, how can you say that when you came in to brief the president, you briefed him from a base of ignorance?
So again, just to respectfully disagree with something you said earlier, I don't believe I've said to the committee last November that I had no involvement whatsoever. What I said was I didn't have a really detailed knowledge base of what actually happened in response to a question about something or the other. So, but again, the point I wanted to make was that I didn't have that level of really detailed knowledge. I did have the kind of involvement that I described in my testimony earlier.
Okay. Well, my last question is, what did you tell the president about HealthCare.gov when you briefed him?
So at the Red Team briefing in early 2013, and then in the follow-up, as I can recall, the gist was, here are the Red Team recommendations in terms of the risks identified and what to do about them. And then in the follow-up in the summer, as I can recall, the briefing again to senior White House officials was that CMS had implemented the key Red Team recommendations.
Did you brief the president or senior White House officials? Was somebody other than the president there?
At those two meetings, as I recall, the president was there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sensenbrenner. We now recognize Mr. Kramer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Park. Mr. Park, I want you to look at tab 5 in the binder, if you would, please.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm. So this is an email that has become a little bit famous today, I noticed. It's an email from Michelle Snyder to you, dated September 29th, posted at 6:22 p.m. And in this email, which, by the way, ends by her asking you to delete it, she writes, quote, "Just so you know, she decided in January we are going no matter what. Hence the really cruel and uncaring march that has occurred since January when she threatened me with a demotion or forced retirement if I didn't take this on. Do you really think she has enough understanding of the risks to fight for a delay? No, and hell no. For just one moment, let's be honest with each other," unquote. Now, Mr. Park, it's, I think, a reasonable inference that the she in the email is Marilyn Tavener, because Ms. Snyder is responding to an email from you to her that same day at 5:54 that says, quote, "MT said that she appreciates the additional info we will generate tonight, but that she and she alone will make the decision to go or not," end quote. Mr. Park, what were these risks that Ms. Snyder referenced in her email that she asked you to delete?
At the time, what I recall was doing was helping CMS basically get additional hardware in place to provide additional server capacity for the federal facilitated marketplace, and that was the issue that we were talking about.
So the risk was there wasn't enough hardware. I mean, in other words, you testified that you thought everything was ready to go, that you were confident. This is September 29th. I mean, the risk was hardware?
So the risks I think that are being referred to in this email is that, based on what we had been talking about, where I'd been asked to be helpful, and the hardware did actually get to where it needed to go in a operation that worked pretty well.
So in the same email chain about 3 hours earlier, she asked you this question. That's, by the way, located on tab 6. So
thank you, sir.
Sure. She asked the question, a series of questions, but one of them is, should we go live on October 1? Now, again, I remind, this is September 29th, so she's asking pretty close, should we be going live on October 1?
Sorry, could you just say that one more time? So who's asking whom?
So it's the same email chain. You asked Ms. Snyder a series of questions, one of which is, should we go? So when you asked her that question, obviously you had some concern, it would seem to me, earlier that day about whether they should even go live.
So again, as I recall, as I'm looking at the email, I was suggesting a set of questions for her to think about as an advisor. And again, this was really, again, focused on the task of getting the hardware in place.
Did you ask the same question of anyone else? I mean, whether it was Henry Chow or maybe somebody in the White House, Marilyn Tavener, or was this just between you and Ms. Snyder? Did you raise this question with other people that might be in a position to do something more about it?
So I think Michelle was actually, as I recall, pretty central to this, and so I was injecting this set of questions as questions I thought that would be good for CMS to think through in the run-up.
So some of these risks that Ms. Snyder was raising that you think, did you ever share it beyond that? Because clearly there's this confidence, it appears, between you and her. I mean, she references in other parts of it as the rant. She refers to probably or possibly losing her job if she raises these risks with the wrong people. In fact, she did, of course, announce her resignation not too long after all of this. What I'm trying to get at is that as an advisor, was your advice only given to this one person, or were others higher up the chain? I mean, considering that earlier you testified, you did, of course, brief the president himself. Was there other concern raised by other people to these risks that seem to be so central between you and Ms. Snyder?
So with respect to what we're talking about here, which, as I recall, are risks associated with not having enough server capacity, the CMS senior management team, Office of Health Reform at the White House, were following what was happening very closely.
And that gave you all the confidence in the world, that extra service space, that was all that was necessary to
Well, the
mitigate.
specific question that I got asked to be helpful on was getting hardware to the data center for additional server capacity, and that operation did end up being successful, as I recall.
All right, my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Now, I recognize Mr. Posey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Park, in an email chain with a subject heading, "How serious are you about using Homestead Air Force Base to get the equipment to Culpeper?" This is dated September 28, 2013. It's located in your tab 12.
Oh, thank you, sir.
You and Mr. Henry Chow worked with Mrs. Laura Fashing from Verizon Terramark to discuss several last-minute options to transport some hardware or computer equipment by either private ground, private jet, cargo, or even Air Force jets. For someone claiming to not have a detailed knowledge base of what actually happened pre-October the 1st, you seem to be all in on a lot of aspects of operations related to the HealthCare.gov website. And so I'm wondering whose idea it was to procure the equipment and what the need was for spending $40,000 to taxpayers' money to transport computer equipment by plane.
So first of all, thank you for the question. Just to clarify, when I say really detailed knowledge base of what actually happened prior to October 1, I'm not talking about like one narrow aspect of what happened. I'm talking about the full breadth of what happened over the course of the project. So, and as I've said, I did assist and advise CMS in a few different capacities. This was one where what happened is CMS contacted me, as I can recall, and said, we think we have, long story short, a need for additional hardware to get to the data center. And they were the ones who teed up the notion of potentially a military option, and I volunteered to help look into that for them.
Okay. Is it routine for a White House official, or actually an assistant to the president, as you were at the time, to be engaged in last-minute discussions with a contractor about the delivery of computer equipment? And, why and how did you get involved in that?
So my style is to try to help in every way I possibly can. So I got asked to help with this, and I threw myself into trying to help. And although the military option ended up not being used, didn't have to be used, there's private transport. The operation to get hardware there worked out.
That sounds like a pretty detailed knowledge base.
Not of the whole project and how it was working. This is one very specific, very narrow aspect in one episode in time.
You also appear to be the point of contact for most interactions with technology companies, and the people such as Palantir, Red Hat, Alex Karp, MITRE, and even Gartner, a company used to help with the administration's messaging on HealthCare.gov around the time of a committee on Homeland Security hearing on September 11th, 2013. In fact, a Gartner analyst provided a quote that the statements made in a CMS letter to a ranking member of Homeland Security Committee represent current best practices for the protection of sensitive and regulated data and systems. That's on page 14.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Wondering how often you reach out to such companies or people to talk about aspects of HealthCare.gov website for either PR purposes or technical purposes.
Not that often as I can recall. But on several occasions, yes.
In what others do you recall?
So you mentioned this one. I can speak to Red Hat. So what happened there was that CMS asked me to be on the phone with them as they asked for additional Red Hat resources to be applied, and just to communicate that this was a top priority of the government, which I volunteered to do. I can talk to the Palantir example. So there, again, as part of my role as a facilitator, I connected Palantir to CMS to have a discussion at a high level about cybersecurity.
That's a little bit beyond the scope of advisory, though, wouldn't you think?
Not in my experience, no.
Okay, arranging contractors to get together and...
No, I mean, actually, it's assisting, as I've said, in a few different capacities.
What did they have to say about the website? Did they ever provide feedback to you on the security or aspects of the website?
So as I can recall, the Palantir conversation, I think the expert said, here's what you should be thinking about, and CMS said that basically accords what we're thinking about, and so that was what I recall of the call.
That's the only time you're aware of any security issue at all?
Again, in that call, basically it was a very high-level call, and Palantir said, just kind of not with any particular knowledge of HealthCare.gov, like here are the kinds of things that represent cybersecurity best practices, and CMS said, yep, that makes sense. That's what we're thinking too.
Yeah. You had mentioned that you would use the website. Just out of curiosity, are you enrolled in Obamacare?
I am not, but I continue to get my insurance through the federal government. But my tour of duty in government, which has been the greatest experience of my life, will at some point end. And I'm very excited about enrolling in Covered California, which is the marketplace in California when I do roll off.
Yeah, the people who wrote the bill aren't in it either, so don't feel bad about that. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. Now, Mr. Johnson, from Ohio, you recognize with.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Park.
Good morning, sir.
You and I share something in common. My background is 30 years in information technology. I've never been a chief technical officer, but I've certainly been a program manager, project manager, chief information officer, even had chief technical officers work for me. So,
God bless you.
Yeah, so I certainly understand from where you come. And I must confess to you, Mr. Park, that I find it a little bit disingenuous that you would qualify or classify your role in all of this as simply an advisor. In 2008, when the President issued a position paper on the use of technology and innovation, he talked about standing up the nation's first chief technology officer. And to quote from what came directly from, at that time, the campaign website, said that the CTO will ensure the safety of our networks and will lead an interagency effort working with the chief technology and information officers of each of the federal agencies to ensure that they use best-in-class technologies and share best practices. In November of 2008, the President reiterated his intentions, and again quoting from the President-elect's website, that he would appoint the nation's first chief technology officer to ensure the safety of our networks. Before that it said ensuring the security of our networks. So whether you envisioned your role being an advisor, the President said you were responsible. That's what ensuring means. As a CIO, as a project manager, I know what ensuring means. It was your job to ensure the safety and security of those networks, at least according to what the President was telling the American people. So I want to go to your role as the co-chair of the ACAIT Exchange Steering Committee. If I look at that document, the charter that set that up, one of the responsibilities in there is to direct the formulation of work groups to identify the barriers and recommend fixes and those kinds of things. And two of those working groups were directly related to data sharing and privacy and security harmonization. What was your role then as the co-chair? You either misrepresented your knowledge of cybersecurity to the President, or you didn't do your job. Which was it?
So thank you for the opportunity to address, I think, a couple different questions embedded in there. and I respect your service as a technologist, sir, to the country. The position of U.S. CTO has evolved quite a lot, I think, over the years. And what I can represent is what I did in the role. And cybersecurity ops for the federal government has very much not been part of my role.
Well, I don't want to use the whole time. I don't want to use the whole time just pontificating, Mr. Park. When you were with Athena Health, was cybersecurity a part of what you considered important in standing up that cloud-based system? Sure, it was. Okay. On September the 2nd of 2013, you sent an email to Christopher Jennings. It said, "Hi, Chris. Here are the cybersecurity background points for you. The first 3 are the points CMS put together previously, which I'm sure you've already seen. They are followed by a couple of points about next steps currently underway." So are you trying to tell this committee that you knew nothing about the security failures and the security risks associated with HealthCare.gov?
Would you mind just pointing me to the email that you were referencing to? I think it's.
I'm not sure where it is in your tab, but I've got it here. I don't know where it is in your tab.
Okay. Let me just speak to, I think, the episode that I think you're talking about. Long story short, because I know we have very little time left. So the content that was put together for Office of Health Reform on cybersecurity was content supplied by CMS and HHS.
But Mr. Park, there you are being disingenuous again. You are the nation's CTO, appointed by the President to ensure the safety and security of our networks. You can't just say this was CMS's responsibility. And let me remind you that you can delegate responsibility to people that do the actual coding, to project managers and program managers, but you can't delegate accountability.
So again,
and you are responsible. You are accountable to the President and to the American people. Now, you've testified this morning that you briefed the President several times. Did you ever once tell the President that you had concerns about the security of the system in your role as Chief Technical Officer?
So again, to go back to, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding. In my role as U.S. CTO, I haven't been, cybersecurity operations hasn't been a focus.
But it was as co-chair of the steering committee. It was clearly in the charter. The co-chair of the steering committee, you did have that responsibility.
I was co-chair on one of 3 co-chairs on a committee organized by OMB. And there was the privacy and security subgroup, as you have mentioned. But that was staffed and led by agency personnel and was really self-propelled and driven by them. The point of us as co-chairs was to provide a neutral venue where agencies could get together to do that work.
Well, that's not my reading of the charter, but my time has expired, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now I recognize my friend Eric Swalwell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also would like to take a moment to thank you for your service. And you served 2 years as ranking member and 4 years as chairman of this committee. And you've always conducted yourself and your chairmanship with dignity and courtesy. And I know Mr. Maffei has also shared that with me privately. And so I wanted to thank you for that. Today may be a day of disagreement, but I sincerely believe that if we conduct this hearing fairly, as we have in the past, that we will emerge as with a better understanding of what Mr. Park did and, most importantly, did not do with respect to HealthCare.gov. Fairness is particularly important because this hearing has the feeling, quite frankly, as a former prosecutor, of a trial. And the only witness before us is Mr. Park. The title of the hearing implies that we are going to examine his involvement in the development of the HealthCare.gov website. But most significantly, a staff report released by you, Mr. Chair, and Chairman Smith on October 28th functions as a prosecutor's memorandum that makes very damning allegations regarding Mr. Park's honesty before the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and Dr. Holdren's candor in his replies to this committee regarding Mr. Park's involvement in cybersecurity. As a former prosecutor, I believe that allegations made against Mr. Park could place him in legal jeopardy. He deserves a chance to tell his own story and put these allegations to rest, and I believe he can do that. Mr. Park is a successful entrepreneur in the IT world who took a break from developing successful companies to come to Washington, D.C. to help the government and the country think of creative ways to use information technology to improve our economy and address important social problems. He's a patriot, and he's a son of immigrants who have played their own role in keeping the American economy vibrant and expanding. Mr. Park's parents, I understand, are here today, as is his wife, as is his pastor, and friends from the IT business world. I mention this to remind all members to not confuse their feelings towards the Affordable Care Act with Mr. Park as a person. He served the public and did his best and should be thanked for his contributions. In fact, Mr. Park has returned to the Bay Area, and I know people personally who have been contacted by Mr. Park, who he's trying to recruit to bring bright, young, innovative stars to the IT world to take a break from the multi-million-dollar contracts that they have in Silicon Valley, come out to Washington, D.C., and try and solve problems. I cannot imagine that this helps him make that case. In fact, this probably makes it much harder for him to make that case to go through a process like this. I reviewed a minority staff report, which I asked be made part of the record, built on a complete review of the documents produced by the White House. The staff makes a very strong argument, supported by White House documents, that Mr. Park did not have a deep, direct, or intimate involvement in any of the work of developing the online marketplace launched on October 1st, 2013, or the cybersecurity standards and techniques used for the site. If he was playing such a role, there should be monthly progress reports from contractors that show progress against deliverables and requirements, costs of work, a critical path analysis that identifies where problems threaten a successful launch, and a discussion of the integration process for the site across an army of contractors on the project. None of these documents have been produced because Mr. Park was not the day-to-day manager on the project, nor are there any kind of documents that any of the contractors produce doing the actual work could possess, which would result or include a discussion of code, performance, and testing results. Those documents can be found at CMS, which managed this complex acquisition among the contractors. I believe that Mr. Park's job was about trying to push technology, and the record and evidence supports that. Technology throughout all levels of the country to improve our competitiveness and quality of life. As just one example, Mr. Park drove an initiative to find innovative methods to use IT and big data to combat human trafficking. I don't think there's any member who favors human trafficking. That is about as nonpartisan as an initiative as you can get. Mr. Park was working full-time in a much wider swath of issues and areas than HealthCare.gov. Members, I hope, will not lose sight of that and get tunnel vision about Mr. Park simply because we have such a narrow set of records. I believe that if Mr. Park is given a fair chance, a fair opportunity to answer questions here today, that members on both sides of the aisle will conclude that Mr. Park was not a principal actor in the development of HealthCare.gov prior to October 1st, 2013, and had no role in developing cybersecurity standards or techniques for the website. Mr. Park, I'm going to apologize to you now for the way you have been treated, and I'm hopeful that you will get apologies from the chairman and other members by the end of this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, Mr. Chair, I understand that the Chair will yield to me 5 minutes of questions, which I also appreciate.
And you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Park, you are not a cybersecurity expert, are you?
I am not.
Okay. Mr. Park, the White House provided several emails from you to CMS relating to cybersecurity. Was there ever a time where you were writing to CMS to give them direction on cybersecurity standards, design, testing, or tools?
Not that I can recall, no.
When you wrote to CMS, Mr. Park, about cybersecurity, you were doing it because someone at the White House had asked you to gather information, whether for a briefing or meetings or to use as a press event for the White House. Is that correct?
Correct.
When Dr. Holdren wrote to this committee that, quote, Mr. Park and OSTP personnel have not been substantially involved in developing or implementing the federally facilitated marketplace's security measures, and Mr. Park is not a cybersecurity expert, he did not develop or approve the security measures in place to protect the website, and he does not manage those responsible for keeping the site safe. Is every element of the statement made by Dr. Holdren that I just read correct?
Yes, sir.
Henry Chow ran the website development for CMS, and Mr. Chow told the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee that he did not run the cybersecurity side of development. With 100% confidence, do you know, before October 2013, who was in charge of cybersecurity on this process?
I believe it was Tom Schenkweiler, but I'm not 100% sure he was the leader.
Henry Chow, who was doing the day-to-day management of the development of HealthCare.gov, was interviewed by the staff of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He was asked if you, Todd Park, played a management role and replied that, this is Mr. Chow's words, you didn't own anything, meaning he didn't have the budgets, the staff, the contractors. So the day-to-day management really still falls to the operating agencies, end quote. Is this an accurate statement, Mr. Park?
Yes, sir.
Were you a manager on the HealthCare.gov website?
I was not a hands-on project manager, sir, as I've described. I did assist in particular ways that I've testified to earlier.
Did you have any control, authority over budgets, staff, or contractors?
No, sir.
And you asked Mr. Chow about attending the July 19th readiness review, which was to be an end-to-end review with all of the contractors about the state of the program. Initially, Mr. Chow said yes. Then you mentioned in an email to Michelle Snyder, Mr. Chow's supervisor, that you were going to be a, quote-unquote, fly on the wall at the event. And then Ms. Snyder responds that, in quote, begin quote, flies on the wall are seldom invisible and are often distracting, end quote. Then Mr. Chow writes a letter that the review is not the place for an observer. Did you go to this meeting?
I did not.
You spoke with Mr. Chow and Ms. Snyder about getting a walkthrough of the live website system as it was developing in mid-July. People are alleging that you were deeply involved in the implementation and development of the site. So I assume that you got that walkthrough very quickly.
As I recall, I believe the walkthrough ended up happening with me and other officials in early September.
Now, was that a walkthrough that was exclusive to you, or were there other officials present?
Other officials were present.
Those managing or directing multi-billion-dollar developmental projects always get a core set of documents to track progress. Usually, it's in the form of a monthly report from contractors that show their performance on requirements, the dollars spent, the value achieved, and the critical path issues. Without these detailed reports, Mr. Park, is it possible to have a detailed knowledge of how a project is going at an on-the-ground level? And if so, did you have any reports that would inform you on this?
You need those kinds of reports, and frankly, you need more. You need to be on the ground.
And were you on the ground?
No, sir.
Did you have those reports?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, being a spokesperson or collecting talking points for a briefing does not translate into intimate involvement in the development and testing of the website. Mr. Park was not managing the acquisition. He was not directing the development or designing the cybersecurity system. And he sure as heck was not a contractor down in the trenches writing code, which I think is pretty apparent from his testimony. He was the chief technology officer of the United States with a broad portfolio ranging from human trafficking to other important technology advising. And he did a lot more work with that portfolio than any two normal people could pull off. But at some point, the actual evidence has to guide our opinion of Mr. Park, which is that he was not intimately involved in the development of HealthCare.gov. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Swallow. And you reminded me that without objection, we will enter in the record our own majority staff report. Now I will recognize without objection, the chair recognizes Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this subcommittee hearing. Even though I do not serve on this subcommittee and do serve on the full committee, it's an area of interest to me, and I'm glad to be here today. And I want to thank Mr. Park for being here and withstanding this line of questioning that frankly concerns me. I want to align myself with the remarks made by my colleagues, Mr. Peters and Mr. Swalwell. When we have someone who has come and given so much to this country from the private sector and done so much, we want to make sure that we send a message to the American public that we appreciate your sacrifice and all of your hard work, Mr. Park. And I would imagine that when you said yes, when you were asked to come and serve your country, you never imagined that you would be sitting in a subcommittee hearing with what appears to be a game of gotcha about a whole series of emails. So I want to start by, again, saying thank you so much for your service. As someone who represents a district in Oregon with a lot of high-tech industry and innovation, I appreciate all you've been doing and understand that the drive for IT innovation to improve service delivery is something that we can all benefit from. So thank you for your expertise.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome, and apologies for perhaps being a bit repetitive on some of these issues, but I just want to make sure a couple of things are clear, and that's what happens when you go last, is that sometimes you sound like you're being repetitive. But I know that the title on the majority's report says something about knowingly put American sensitive information at risk. And that's the title of the report. So, Mr. Park, did your interactions with the administration personnel working on HealthCare.gov give you any cause to worry that they would knowingly put Americans' sensitive information at risk?
Not that I can recall, no.
Thank you. And I understand that from the documents that were provided to us by the majority, what we've been looking at here is numerous emails that were exchanged with members of the administration and officials on the subject of HealthCare.gov. But what we have not seen is what must be many emails that you have exchanged with them on other efforts that occupied your time. I know, for example, that you worked on the Connect Ed initiative, and given my role on the Education Committee, I'm grateful for your efforts with that as well. So we heard about a couple of other areas that you worked on, but I understand that you oversaw at least 15 initiatives, including HealthCare.gov. So would you care to tell us a little bit about a few of those others, just so that we can understand the breadth of what you were doing?
Sure. And just to be specific, I think the 15 you're referring to, these are initiatives that I was either championing or co-championing. That didn't include HealthCare.gov. Advice and assistance to HealthCare.gov was something I classified into a chunk of my time that was set aside for reacting and helping on issues as they arose. But in terms of the 15 or so initiatives that I was directly helping to drive, as I described earlier, they included open data initiatives to help unlock the power of data inside the federal government by making it available in machine-readable form for the public so that entrepreneurs and technologists could grab it and turn it into all kinds of incredible services and products and improvements in life and jobs, much as the National Weather Service's release of weather data has really powered all kinds of innovation in weather and jobs as a result. I championed a set of initiatives, as has been described, to do things like harness the power of private sector technologists and innovators to help fight the evil of human trafficking, rallying innovators to build tools that could help with that. Similarly, did the same thing to help improve American disaster recovery and response. I worked on policy initiatives like how to advance a free and open internet, how to actually share wireless spectrum more efficiently and effectively across the country as demand for spectrum continues to increase significantly. I was a co-founder of the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program that brings in amazing technologists from the private sector to work with the best technologists and change agents in government on all kinds of exciting initiatives like Blue Button and Green Button to help Americans get access to their own health data, their own electricity usage data, and more.
Right. Well, thank you, and I think we get a sense from that of many of the areas where you do have expertise and where you did serve our country, and I want to suggest that the time on the Science Committee would have been much better spent on talking about some of those issues like open access, like innovation in healthcare technology, rather than trying to get you to say that you were an expert in cybersecurity, which obviously from everything that I have read and seen and heard, you are not on this issue. So thank you again for spending your time here. Thank you for your service. And I hope that we can have you come back sometime and talk about those areas that the public would really be interested in hearing about. That, to me, Mr. Chairman, would be a great use of Science Committee time. Thank you again, Mr. Park, for your service.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Your time is expired. Before we adjourn, I'd like to give myself some leeway as chairman of this subcommittee for the last time with one last question from you, Mr. Park.
Yes, sir.
One of your emails provided to the committee late last Friday was one on October the 10th, where you forwarded an article that you had read by David Kennedy, a white hat hacker who has testified twice before this committee about his concern. The headline from that article was, "Is the Affordable Health Care website secure?" Probably not, Mr. Park. If you want to refer to it, it's in tab 15 in your binder.
Thank you, sir.
You even commented about David Kennedy's article that, quote, "This got sent to me by someone who says these guys are on the level," unquote. Other documents provided to the committee show that several other cybersecurity experts expressed concerns with the security of the website around that same time. Mr. Park, do you think that David Kennedy's concerns with the security of the website are on the level?
Thank you for the question. As I recall, this did get sent to me by someone who thought that Trusted Sec was someone that was worth paying attention to. I can't comment on that.
Do you think he was on the level, yes or no?
I don't have the judgment, the knowledge of cybersecurity to say, and so that's why I forwarded it immediately to CMS, which then evaluated it and had the response that you see.
Are you being level with us today?
Yes, sir.
Okay. According to news reports, you reportedly briefed President Obama, Vice President Biden, Health Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, and others about the problems with the website only a few days after reading David Kennedy's report. Did you ever express the warnings that was in David Kennedy's report about the lack of security with the website to the President or others in the White House in that October meeting or any other previous meetings?
So again, I think, as I think this email demonstrates, I forwarded this to CMS right away, and CMS responded saying CMS acknowledges this feedback by the security community analysis of
So just forwarding the email was the only warning that you gave to anyone, is that correct?
Well, it says analysis of the code and a review of the operational environment has confirmed that the site is secure and operating with low risk to consumers, which then got forwarded back to me.
So but that was the only warning you gave anybody, is that correct?
Well, sir, again, cybersecurity is handled by CMS.
Okay, I'm just asking. That's a yes or no question.
I can report what happened, which is I sent this.
Okay.
CMS evaluated.
I take that
the response.
I take that the answer is no. Mr. Park, I want to thank you for finally appearing before this committee.
Mr.
I'm
Chairman,
sorry that
may I have
had
a follow-up question too?
No, sir.
Okay.
We've got to adjourn.
I have a follow-up.
Mr. Park, I'm sorry we came to the point where we had to subpoena you to come before this committee, but thank you for coming, even possibly under duress. But obviously people can disagree about whether you were deeply involved or not with HealthCare.gov website. While I thank you for your government service, the fact remains that the rollout of the HealthCare.gov website last year was a debacle. And that's not my assessment, but that of Health Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. My assessment of this situation remains that you and others in the White House have been neither forthright or forthcoming about your role and responsibilities at the White House. Integrity in government is integral to the public's faith in our democracy. Thus, our nation's leaders must be open and honest with our fellow Americans in respective roles of the executive branch and Congress is articulated in our Constitution. The fact remains that the White House still has not provided all the documents pursuant to the committee's subpoena. We've asked for them, we subpoenaed them, we still haven't gotten them. And perhaps that is why people still disagree about your role in the debacle. Eternal vigilance is the price we pay for our liberty. To that end, the committee maintains that all documents pursuant to the subpoena be provided, and we ask for the administration to please provide those expeditiously. After a more thorough assessment of these documents, you may be called to appear before us again, Mr. Park, in order to one day reach a better understanding. While I may no longer be in Congress on that day, the committee's vigilance on this matter will carry on. Honest people can fundamentally disagree on several matters of national importance, and we've seen that today. For example, you believe that Obamacare will be a great thing for Americans, but I think too much of it was predicated on a lie. As a medical doctor, I believe that Obamacare is the wrong prescription for what ails our nation's health care system, but that is a debate for another time. With that, I want to thank you, Mr. Park, for appearing before us today, and members for your questions. Members of the committee may have additional questions for you, Mr. Park, and we will ask that you respond to those in writing, please, and do so expeditiously. I want to thank my friend Dan Maffei and Eric Swalwell for y'all working with me and through this process. It's been a great experience for me, and I consider you a friend and consider Dan a friend, and I consider all y'all staff to be excellent. It's been great working with y'all, and I had the opportunity to work with Ms. Bonamici also, and I enjoyed working with her. I told her earlier today she just left me, so but it has been a great experience, and I've been tremendously honored by chairing this subcommittee. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. The witness is excused. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Well,
Just want to shake the hands.
yes, yes.
To return. Thank you.